Many Americans are unfortunately struggling economically right now. But then on the other side of the equation, when you look at social media or you look at some of the economic data, other Americans are rolling in it. They're thriving economically. So the question becomes, what is the true state of the American consumer right now? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it somewhere in the middle? And of course, it's going to be different for different people, depending on your job, where you live, what stage of life that you're in. But we can learn a bit about the average American consumer if we look at some of the data. And I'll just let you know right now, it's a little bit murky. It's going to be tough to make broad declarations like Americans are doing good or Americans are doing bad. So instead, what we have to do is look at the specifics and understand some of the nuances behind the economic data. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to break down 4 really important topics. I'm going to look at real wage growth and income growth and how it compares to inflation. Then we're going to talk about credit card debt, auto debt and delinquencies, and we're going to get into housing and how that is really playing a large role in the finances of the average American. And after looking at this, I think you're going to get a better, fuller picture of the state of the American consumer. And this should, as an investor, help you make decisions and understand sort of where we are holistically and how some of the bigger, broader macro things going on could impact your portfolio. So let's start with the beginning and what I think matters most to most Americans, which is income growth. And when we look at income growth, what we have to be talking about is quote unquote real wages. If you haven't heard this term before, real basically just means inflation adjusted. So when you look at how much your income is going up and compare that to how much expenses are going up, are things getting better or worse? And when you look at this chart here, what you can see is that real wages are actually going up right now. So you look at the purple line, that is how much the average American's income is going up, and it's at about 4.7% year over year. And inflation has been coming down. It's in the mid 2s as of this recording in the middle of September. But what also you see in this chart is that that has not been the case for a lot of the last few years. And from basically the beginning of 2021 to the middle of 2023, the opposite was true. So inflation was higher than income growth. And what that basically boils down to is that people's spending power declined for several years. And although that has flipped about a year and a half ago, I think the psychological effect is still there. I mean, don't get me wrong. The good thing is that real wages are up. And for the last year, people's spending power, obviously it depends on what you spend your money on average has been going up. But it really hasn't, in my opinion, compensated for years of declining spending power. So I think even though things are getting better objectively, just looking at the data, it makes sense. People are still feeling that they have less money than a couple of years ago. And that's not to disparage anyone. The psychological element of the economy is super important. When people don't feel like they have as much money, they probably pull back on spending, and that impacts the entire broader economy. So that said, I don't think we're like out of the woods and that people are feeling super confident about their incomes, but I do think there is a positive trend going on here where you see that wages are actually going up above inflation. And if you look at the trend lines, it does look like, at least for now, that this is going to continue, provided that the labor market doesn't break down in some significant way. So that's the first thing. Real wages are up, but probably not in a way that are making people feel a whole lot better about their economic situation. Second thing we're going to look at today is credit card debt. You probably have heard this already, but credit card debt is up to all-time highs at about $1.1 trillion. A lot of these people on this channel are real estate investors, and so we look at debt, I think, a little differently than a lot of people because at least I believe there are a lot of good types of debt. If you take out debt to buy a rental property and that helps you make more money, that's, I think, positive debt. Credit card debt, at least to me, is not positive. I don't think there's really any good case to be made to say that high credit card debt is a good thing. This is high interest debt. It can really compound and be really damaging to anyone who carries credit card balances. So I think this is sort of an ominous sign for the economy, showing that people keep spending even when they have to borrow to do it. So I don't think this is a great sign for the economy in any way, but I do want to caveat this with one thing, because saying that there's more and more credit card debt is true, but you also have to look at people's spending power and the total monetary supply. So if you look at this chart above, you can see that credit card debt as a percentage of disposable income, so non-essential spending, is actually down. And I know that is confusing to people, but if you think about all of the things that have gone on over the last couple of years, where spending went up, savings rates went up during the pandemic, there were stimulus checks, and there was a lot of money printing over the last couple of years. And so when you see, yes, the total amount of dollars for credit card debt is up, the percentage of that credit card debt, given all the money that's out there, is actually down. And given all of the money that Americans now have and have saved up, is actually down. And don't get me wrong, I think a lot of credit card debt is not a good thing at all. But if you look at how it compares to recent years, the level of indebtedness, credit card indebtedness in the United States, basically how much money out of your pocket is going towards credit card debt, hasn't really changed. And I think that's a really important distinction that doesn't necessarily make all of the headlines right now, but really is important for everyone to understand. So for me, like the total number, that number of $1.1 trillion in debt is not an acute concern, right? Like I think credit card debt is a big deal, but it's not a bigger deal than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It's always been a big deal. But there is something that does worry me about credit card debt, and it's the delinquency rate is accelerating. If you check out this chart from the New York Federal Reserve, they do a great job tracking consumer debt. And what they show here, as you can see, this dark blue line at the top here on the right, is that delinquencies on credit card debt is really starting to rise. We've gone above the 10% rate, which obviously doesn't mean anything in a vacuum. But if you look at it, the last time credit card delinquency rates went above 10% was right before the great financial crisis. Now, the financial crisis was caused much more by mortgage debt, not consumer debt. But I do think this tells a picture that Americans are still spending and they're putting things on their credit card and they're not able to pay off their credit card as agreed. And to me, that is definitely a concerning sign about the economy. And a similar thing is happening with our third data set that we're looking at, which is car ownership. Car ownership, automobiles, American society, very dependent on cars. Most people have cars. A lot of people have 2 cars. But this is an area where Americans are getting absolutely hammered on the cost of automobiles. Payments, of course, are up due to higher interest rates and higher prices on cars. But costs are actually up like in other ways that you might not think about. Insurance costs for cars are actually up 50% since 2019, which is huge. That's much faster than the pace of regular inflation. And maintenance costs are up 40%. So this is just like getting kicked while you're down, right? Payments are up. Car prices are up. And then on top of that, insurance costs and maintenance costs are up. So this is really hurting the average American, is just car ownership in general. The somewhat good news is that gas prices are down from 2022 highs, but that is not really going to make anyone feel a lot better because they're still up 20% over 2019 levels. So yeah, they were really high 2 years ago. They have come down, but it's still putting a dent in people's wallets compared to pre-pandemic levels. So overall, if it feels like you're just taking all of your money, putting it in your gas tank and lighting it on fire, you're sort of right. That's really happening with car ownership. And like I said, this is impacting people in terms of their debt and their ability to repay their debt. If you look back to the chart I just showed you about delinquencies on credit card debt, you can see that auto debt is going up, but just a little bit right now. But the trend is a little bit concerning. It's definitely starting to tick up. And if I had to guess, I would say that this is probably going to keep going as the labor market has been softening over the last couple of months. What we've talked about so far, just before I get into the last thing, housing, just as a recap, real wages are up and have been for about a year, but that's following several years where real wages are down, and I think people are still feeling a loss of spending power. The second thing is that credit card debt is at all-time highs, and although that total number is not crazy when you look at monetary supply, the delinquency rate is concerning. And then third, car ownership is crushing Americans. This is due to higher interest rates, higher costs on cars, maintenance costs are up, and insurance costs are up. So that is like a quadruple whammy hurting Americans in terms of their spending spending power right now. The last thing I want to talk about in generally is housing. And this, when you look at Americans and how housing impacts their financing, there's basically two different groups here. The first group is people who owned before the pandemic or bought in early years of the pandemic. And those people are doing quite well. You actually see that the average amount of equity in those types of homes has gone up a huge amount. The average equity in a home has actually gone up from about $200,000 to about $300,000. So those people are doing quite well. On the other end of the spectrum, though, are people who have been renting during that entire time, and those people are being negatively impacted by housing costs. It makes logical sense to people. Rents have gone up 30% since pre-pandemic, and we're seeing them go up faster than wages. So people who are renting are putting more of their income towards rent. And you see this in a lot of different ways, but one thing I like to look at is what is called rent burden. Economists, personal finance experts, they say that you should spend no more than 30% of your income on rent. And actually, for a while in 2023, the average went above. So the nation as a whole became, on average, quote unquote, rent burdened at about 31%. Luckily, due to that real wage growth that I was talking about and flattening rent increases, that has come down and it's about 30% right now. But that is still relatively high. Like, we're right on the edge of what you would consider rent burden. And so this is, again, I think something that is going to constrain American spending power and is really hurting people on top of high car rates. If you're a renter, rent prices are really high right now. That section of the American economy is struggling. Meanwhile, as I said, average equity in homes is at all-time highs. People who have owned homes for years have a lot of built-up money and equity in their homes. And as of right now, we've been talking a lot about debt delinquencies. Foreclosure rates are super low. Just check out this chart here. You can see that foreclosure rates, since the eviction moratorium, since the foreclosure and forbearance programs put in, since those have been lifted, foreclosures are still extremely low. They're well below pre-pandemic levels. They're not even close to where we were in the lead up to the great financial crisis. You can see even bankruptcies are relatively low. And so even though we're seeing delinquency rates and debt trouble start to rear its head in the credit card market and in the auto market, we are not seeing the same thing in the housing market. It is quite stable. So that's basically what I had to show you guys. As you can see, you can't really make a declaration saying Americans are doing well, Americans are not doing well. It's a much murkier gray zone than I think anyone really wants it to be, but that's what it is. You have to look at these individual criteria. Real wages are up, but just slightly after disappointing years of growth. The total debt levels for individuals are not a huge concern, but delinquency rates on car loans and on credit card loans certainly are concerning and something I'm personally going to be keeping a closer eye on. Meanwhile, the housing market is pretty stable. Despite a lot of people calling for housing crashes, we're just not seeing that. And even with the labor market starting to weaken, there are not a lot of signs that that's anywhere around the corner. And it's not just me who is struggling to define the American consumer right now. The last chart I'll show you guys is actually a measure of self-reported consumer sentiment. It's a great thing to track if you like the economy. University of Michigan puts this out. It just tracks consumer sentiment over time. And what you can see is people can't decide. It is trending up since July of 2023, but you see a lot of variance in consumer sentiment right now, which is not really that normal. Usually it's pretty stable pre-pandemic, but as you can see, some people are doing well, some people are not. All these changes in the economy that are going on relatively rapidly are impacting people's sentiment. If you are thinking, hey, I don't know what's going on, it's super confusing, you are absolutely not the only one. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be studying and learning about this stuff. I think as investors, it's super important to understand what's going on in the minds of the American consumer. If you're a landlord, you should understand what's going on with your renters on a financial basis. Or if you're considering buying in a new market, you probably want to understand how the average person in that area is faring right now and whether there's likely to be more economic turmoil in your market than in the nation as a whole. So hopefully this video has been helpful to you and you can start doing some of your own analysis to track the economy and apply what you learn to your own portfolio. All right, that's what I got for you guys today for BiggerPockets. I'm Dave Meyer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.